Because we have a very nice HDR calibration menu in GTA 5 with options like contrast, paper white and peak brightness, the HDR calibration menu on the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series is not supported. In terms of HDR, I couldn't find any difference between the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series. That's why my settings today are for both platforms, PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series. In terms of HDR black level rays, during cutscenes or loading screens, I was not able to find any issue with my brightness level set to 50. But when you play at night, some locations, it appears to me that there are some sort of elevated black levels. But this can be also a design decision from the developer. So at this very moment, I'm still recommending leave brightness set to 50, because with this setting I have perfect OLED black. And as always, all my findings and all my settings are based on my LG CX 65-inch and my own preference. Feel free to try my settings, but please do not expect the exact same outcome. Okay, so let's start talking about the HDR calibration settings in GTA 5, and don't start to copy and paste those settings, because those settings are the standard settings. I'm going to share, of course, my recommended settings with you in a second or maybe in a minute. Let's start talking about the different settings here: contrast, paper white and peak brightness. During my testing, I spent most of the time with the contrast setting, and this is one of the important settings in GTA 5. So first of all, what I found is contrast does not impact maximum peak brightness at all. Real maximum peak brightness, what I was able to measure with my colorimeter. Regardless if I set this to 0 or 100, I was always able to measure the exact same peak brightness around 650 candela. So again, this is not affecting the maximum peak brightness at all. This is just affecting how much details you can see in darker areas or in shadows. So I would not recommend to go below 50, because below 50 you already start crushing details in very dark objects. So there's no way that you can actually see fine details anymore in shadows, stuff like that. My recommendation is actually stay between 50 and 100 and decide for yourself what you like best, because again, this setting has no impact on the maximum peak brightness at all. It will just give you more or less details in dark areas. The paper white setting is responsible for the average picture brightness, and right now, hopefully you can see it, the picture is very, very dark, and when I'm going to reset this value, then the whole picture is getting much brighter. Especially as an OLED user, we need to be very careful what we set up in this value or on this value, because every OLED TV has very aggressive ABL, and if we increasing paper white too much, then we lose actually a lot of maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. Okay, let me just quickly explain how paper white setting can impact the maximum peak brightness on any OLED TV thanks to ABL, automatic brightness limiter. Paper white is set to 200, and right now I'm measuring 570 candela. Let's increase this to, let's say, 500 to the maximum value, and because the whole picture is getting brighter, I'm now just able to measure 450 candela. This is ABL. This, at some point, the display is limiting the maximum peak brightness, because the average brightness is already much higher compared to setting 200. As you can see, actually the picture is very dark compared to 500, and that's the reason why the LG CX or any OLED TV is not capable anymore to display the very same object with the maximum peak brightness of the TV. Last but not least, we have peak brightness, and this setting of course depends on your maximum peak brightness capability of your TV. In terms of the LG CX C1 or even G1, 800 is actually a very good value to start with. When I started testing HDR in GTA 5, all what I have done for the beginning is change the peak brightness from 850 to 800. So keep in mind, paper white and contrast are not affecting my analyzing at all. What you can see here right now is 800 nits. That's the value what the game likes to output right now. That's not the value what my display can actually show. And I was very happy with the result from the very first screen what I analyzed, because 800 nits output means the setting in the HDR calibration menu in GTA 5 are actually doing what they are supposed to do. But then I checked a couple of other screenshots like this, and I found that right now the game likes to output 880 candela, which of course is way too much for the HGiG. I analyzed of course many more screenshots like this, where I have now a maximum output of 840 candela, which again is a little bit too high for the HGiG, but still in a range where I not to be concerned actually. I found many more screenshots like this where we have almost 900 candela output, and when we have a closer look on the luminance heat map, then we can actually see that this is going into the very orange part already, which can lead to clipping on the HGiG, because it is already a little bit too high. And by the way, I really like it that this is actually called Gefängnis, which is you figured it out what it means. Anyway, so I still think that setting 800 in the HDR calibration menu in GTA 5 is the right value, because I haven't found any issue with setting 800. Even very bright objects like this lamp or this cubic here showing enough details with the highest peak brightness. So with setting 800, I'm more than happy with HDR, especially during the night. I just love it. Okay, so let's start talking about my HDR and of course Dolby Vision settings for my HGiG. And we're starting with dynamic tone mapping on. Contrast between 50 and 100. Don't go below 50 because you will lose all the fine details in very dark objects. 50 is already very, very dark, and I don't like it personally, but that's the lowest setting actually which I would recommend to use. Below 50 there is no details in some very dark objects. Okay, again, keep in mind this setting, contrast, is not affecting the maximum peak brightness from specular highlights. Okay, so feel free, 50 to 100. My recommendation actually, if you can, leave it on 80. Paper white, dynamic tone mapping on, 200 to 220. We know that dynamic tone mapping on is always a little bit brighter in terms of the average picture brightness compared to HGiG or Dolby Vision. That's why I would use a little bit of a lower setting here, because I personally found it already very, very bright. But again, that's just my recommendation. And of course, peak brightness for the HGiG 65-inch is 800. And I'm very sure you already noticed that I'm not recommend to use dynamic tone mapping off, because you will lose a lot of maximum peak brightness. On the same object, I measured with dynamic tone mapping off 470 candela, with dynamic tone mapping on 690 candela, HGiG 680 and Dolby Vision also 680. You can see as soon as you use dynamic tone mapping off, you lose a lot of maximum peak brightness. Let's move on to HGiG, and in terms of contrast settings, the same counts for HGiG as for dynamic tone mapping on. Feel free to try the setting 50 to 100, but my recommendation is actually 80. In terms of paper white, we should increase this a little bit compared to dynamic tone mapping on, because HGiG is a little bit darker in the average picture brightness, but that's just because dynamic tone mapping on is analyzing the screen all the time and changing the picture brightness all the time, which leads actually, especially in the night, to a very bright picture when you use dynamic tone mapping on. So my recommendation actually is to use HGiG if you can, because HGiG is working just perfectly with GTA 5 in my opinion. And with those settings, paper white 250, it is more than enough bright in my opinion. Peak brightness, as always, 800, the same as with dynamic tone mapping on, there's no difference. Okay, so let's move on to Dolby Vision on the Xbox Series, and in terms of contrast, I don't need to say anything else anymore, because it is exactly the same as with HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on. Paper white, as you can see, exactly the same setting, or my recommendation is exactly the same value as with HGiG, because Dolby Vision and HGiG are very, very similar. And the reason is because Dolby Vision is not natively supported by GTA 5. That's why when we're using Dolby Vision, it will use the HDR10 metadata. That's why we shouldn't expect any difference actually. The only difference what you can see here is actually in terms of the peak brightness, because what I learned, and this is not just in GTA 5, in all the games what I found so far or what I tested so far, Dolby Vision is slightly darker in terms of the maximum peak brightness when I'm using exactly the same values. I had to increase the maximum peak brightness to get actually to the 680 candela. Without increasing this and leaving it to 800, I would end up with around 50 to 60 candela less compared to HGiG. So always keep this in mind. If you use Dolby Vision, just increase the maximum peak brightness a little bit compared to HDR10. HGiG or dynamic tone mapping on, and as always, that's absolutely up to you. If you prefer a higher average picture brightness, then go with dynamic tone mapping on. Compared to HGiG in certain situation, yeah, the difference is significant. But also keep in mind, my recommendation is actually HGiG, because especially during the night, I found dynamic tone mapping on way too bright. And what is now with Dolby Vision on the Xbox Series? Do I recommend to play in Dolby Vision? Absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's literally zero difference between HGiG or Dolby Vision, or at least I was not able to find any difference, because it's very hard actually to compare HGiG and Dolby Vision, because yeah, we have always different time of the day and stuff like that. So it was literally not possible to have a proper comparison, okay? I can't complain about Dolby Vision at all. It just looks amazing, the same as with HGiG. And yeah, why not use Dolby Vision if you can? Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video. And if you're using different settings, then please do me the favor and share those settings in the comment section, and we can give it a try, because yeah, my settings are my settings, and that doesn't mean that just my settings are the correct ones. Maybe your settings are much better than my settings. So let's give it a try. And also, I'd like to mention that I put a lot of work in this video. So if you're new to my channel, please do me the favor and yeah, like and subscribe. And yeah, that's it actually. Thank you very much for watching me. I see you guys next time. Bye.